The notion of the Jubilee year comes from the book of Leviticus. It comes from Old Testament times. The book of Leviticus calls for a 50th year to be celebrated. And the reason for 50 years is a logic based upon the notion of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is the seventh day, going back to the pages of Genesis with Adam and Eve, where on the seventh day they rested. In Leviticus, it calls for the 7 days to be replaced by 7-year periods. So that would make 49 years, 7-year periods. And after the celebration of this 7-year period, this sort of Sabbath of Sabbaths, there is a 50th year, this year of Jubilee. And during that year, people would be set free from slavery to which they were held in some type of bondage. They would be set free from debt. People were supposed to live off the sustenance of the land that God provided and allow other people to live off their sustenance as well. And so it was a time of great celebration, a time of great renewal. Now, in order to understand the logic and reasoning behind the Jubilee year, you obviously have to understand the logic and reasoning behind the notion of the Sabbath going back to the pages of Genesis. In the pages of Genesis, we hear how God created all things. And we hear how on the seventh day, after all was created, man rested. So Adam and Eve rested. Now, this notion of rest is far more than just finding some repose from exhaustion. The notion of rest actually communicates a notion of communion, a notion of harmony, a notion of peace and fulfillment and purpose. So what we have is Adam and Eve finding communion and harmony with God, with one another, with nature, and with themselves. So the Sabbath is the fulfillment of a purpose. It's the fulfillment of the meaning for which they were created, communion with God and neighbor. Now, what happens shortly thereafter is sin enters into the equation. And this seventh day, this bright day of rest and communion, turns into a darkness, a dark night. The dark pall of sin and death descends upon human family and the human history. And as a result, all that takes place in the Old Testament is set within this darkness, this context of original sin. And throughout the Old Testament, including the times of Leviticus and thereafter, where they would celebrate Jubilee years, there was a yearning for a new day. There was a yearning for the clock to tick again, a new day of creation. We find that these Jubilee celebrations were an expression of that yearning, and we find fulfillment of those expressions in the person of Christ, such that when in the Gospel of Luke, he opens the scroll in the synagogue in Nazareth and reads out loud the passage of Isaiah, which is basically declaring a year of favor, a year of Jubilee. He is also acknowledging that he himself is the Messiah. He is the one who is about to inaugurate this time of Jubilee. But this time, it's not going to be a mere day or a mere year. This will be a Jubilee of the Messiah, a day of redemption, a new day dawning in the 7 days of creation, an Easter day. And so, the practice of celebrating a Jubilee is, in a sense, simply highlighting the fact that we have been in this period of Jubilee since Christ rose from the dead. This Jubilee, for which all previous Old Testament Jubilees yearned and pointed, is found fulfillment in the person of Christ, in his death and resurrection. We live in Jubilee times. And the discipline of the Church, periodically, for the Holy Father to call Jubilee years, doesn't happen every 50 years. It can happen every other year. But this discipline is the result of highlighting various aspects of the mission of Christ, that we live in the time of Jubilee, we live in the time of redemption. And this Holy Father, Pope Francis, has decided to highlight in this upcoming Jubilee, to begin on the first Sunday of Advent and to end at the end of the liturgical year, the very mercy of God.